Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our session on the parliamentarian dimension of WTO. Our session is organized by the IPU and the European Parliament, and I'm quite happy to have you here in the room or virtually on the screen. My name is Bernd Lange. I'm the co-chair of the steering committee of the Parliamentary Conference of the WTO and as well chair of the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament. Today, we will discuss the item on strengthening the multilateral trading systems through equitable governance of work. And I guess the link between trade and social and environmental standards are attracting an increasing interest around the world. And I guess we have to reflect this because otherwise trade policy might be losing support. And therefore, it is an important topic. And we know that the focus on the 8th Sustainable Development Goal is on sustainable economic growth and decent work. We are therefore looking forward to an interesting discussion with relevance to many parliamentarians, but also, I guess, many people around the globe. So this session, like the whole forum, is taking in a hybrid manner. So we have some interesting people here in the room, but also a lot at home online. So, however, there is a possibility to ask questions, and in two ways. For the people following online this discussion, please use the platform WTOTUP21.org and click the session 33. And there you can write down your question, and hopefully it will appear here on my computer in front of me, so I can ask the panelists the question. For the people here in the room, it's much more easy. Please write down your question on a piece of paper and bring it here to me so that I have a look on the questions for the people here in the room. Unfortunately, you can't take the floor here in the room for technical reasons. So write down the question if you have anyone and bring it to me. So this was my short introduction. And now I give the floor to my distinguished co-chair of the IPU European Parliament Steering Committee for the WTO, Mr. Mansour Nadir. Please.
Thank you, Honorable Bernard.
Thank you very much, Honorable Bernd Lange, co-chair for the PC-WTO Committee of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. I join in welcoming everyone here today. We do appreciate your participation, despite the very busy schedule that all of us have. But noting the special context of the COVID pandemic, it is an honor to welcome everyone. I, as the honorable member, Mr. Lange said, I'm Mansour Nadir, the Speaker of the National Assembly of Guyana and co-chair of this steering committee of the Parliamentary Conference on the WTO. Participants, we have 3 high-level experts who will be on our panel today. May I first recognize Dr. Fadli Zon, Member of Parliament of Indonesia. We have sitting on my left, the Honorable Member, Ms. Marie-Pierre Vedren, I think I've said that correctly, Member of the European Parliament, and we have Ms. Marva Curley Coulibaly, Chief of the Globalization, Competitiveness and Labor Standards Unit at the International Labor Organization. Their respective bios are available at the public forum page on this current session. I wish to welcome all of our panelists And on behalf of everyone, thank you for making yourself available. I'm also pleased to let you know that each panelist will have 10 minutes to present your preliminary comments on our topic. Dr. Zhang, from your views,
Thank you, Honorable
how
Nadir.
could
Oh,
our equitable governance of work strengthen our multilateral trading system? That is the challenge for you this afternoon.
well, thank you
Dr.
very
Zhang?
much, Honorable Manzur Nadir, Honorable Ben Lange, and Marie-Pierre Wedren and Maria Coulibaly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to share views in this forum to answer some of the questions regarding this issue. So the Indonesian House would like to reiterate the importance of supporting the multilateral trading system for a fair, inclusive, non-discriminatory, transparent, and stable trade and investment environment. So it is also crucial to maintain the central role of the WTO as the primary institution for global governance of international trade in order to maintain relevance and respond to the challenges currently being faced by the WTO, including the strengthening of the WTO trade dispute settlement system. Also, to ensure that all countries would reap the benefits of international trade, including the developing and the least developed countries. Indonesia also supports global collaboration on collective action towards a sustainable trade and to further improve governance work in the WTO, taking into consideration of various developments as well as other international commitments and consensuses. So Indonesia views that the protectionist and unilateral measures taken by several countries in the world today can be seen as an attempt to weaken the multilateral trading system and also the WTO. For this reason, Parliament should encourage the governments to continue to prioritize multilateral approach, including ensuring that the WTO can work properly according to its function. And negotiations in the WTO are expected to run in a more balanced manner in the sense that trade needs to be discussed more broadly by taking into account the aspects of sustainable development and the interests of the developing countries and least developed countries. Indonesia also actively participates in various spending negotiations at the WTO and seeks to reach an agreement in order to strengthen the multilateral trading system. We are also open to various developments relating and influencing international trade with a view to have a common shared goal for global economic development. Regarding to the issue of labor rights, as parliaments, we should encourage a more balanced perspective where developed countries should also pay attention to the interests of developing and less developed countries. We are aware that there are two different opinions in this matter. There are countries in favor of inserting social clauses in the international trade agreement as an effort to improve labor rights, but there are also perspectives that see the social clauses as hidden protectionism that may set aside the results of expanding market access that have been hardly earned through the Uruguay round. So those, it will not be effective as free trade and labor rights are seen as two opposing interests. Against this debate, in my opinion, while it is important to make sure that every international trade talk should not disregard the rights of laborers, we also have to be more prudent in discussing this matter and consider all aspects comprehensively. As parliamentarians in handling these differing opinions, it is best that we put forward democracy and multilateral approach with a view to achieve common shared economic goals. So perhaps it is wiser that we as parliamentarians encourage cooperation approach rather than the sanctions-based approach. Cooperation approach may be more effective at helping to improve labor practices in developing countries and less developed countries, as they may provide a more credible advice regarding adequate labor standards. So we may also need to see the fact that in comparison, laborers in developed countries tend to have more comparative advantages than in developing countries or less developed countries, where there are still many unskilled laborers as well as improper working conditions. While it is understood that improving such condition is important, developing and less developed countries may also need assistance in doing so. So this is why cooperation approach is more suitable than sanctions-based approach. In the end, the cooperation approach would hopefully helping to increase demand for products produced in much more improved labor conditions. At the national level, Indonesia continues its work to improve its legal environment through the establishment of Law Number 11 of 2020 on job creation to further progress on various aspects, particularly on labor provisions. The law is also aimed to enhance Indonesia's capacity to be able to adapt with various global developments, as well as to foster job creation and ease of doing business. Another challenge that we are facing in this critical time is probably on how to strike a balance between pushing the economic growth back post the pandemic and fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Agenda. These two things are equally important and must be achieved. To that end, the Indonesian House is of the view that it is important that we as parliamentarians encourage strong political engagement, flexibility, and pragmatism in the 12th Ministerial Conference in order to reach substantive outcomes and reaching conclusions on negotiations by accommodating the best interests of all members, particularly the developing countries and least developed countries. The success of ministerial conference would send a bold message to the world to maintain and strengthen the multilateral trade system. And in order to do that, it is imperative that members show strong political engagement, flexibility, and pragmatism that should take into account the centrality of development issues and the developmental needs of developing countries and least developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zon, for your insightful preliminary inputs. The audience will get back to you later on comments and maybe some additional clarification from your presentation, just to let our audience know that we could learn a lot from Indonesia. They have centered their development around 5-year human development programs. And I think it's been over 60 years they have been so doing. I would now like to give the floor to the Honorable Ms. Vedran to hear her views on equitable governance of work and where she sees the role of parliaments in contributing to consolidating our multilateral trading system.
Thank you. Bonjour à tous, je vais parler en français, donc pour ceux qui n'ont pas leur casque pour la traduction. Je vais repartir d'un événement qui a fait le drame du Rana Plaza, qui a fait qu'au Parlement européen, et Bernd Lange, je suis très heureuse d'être avec lui, beaucoup de collègues au Parlement européen se sont beaucoup investis à ce moment-là, parce que cette tragédie a fait prendre conscience que nos chaînes de valeur doivent être changées et que les enjeux relatifs au droit du travail doivent être pleinement impliqués au travers de notre politique commerciale. Il y a eu une prise de conscience aiguë et l'Union européenne, avec le gouvernement du Bangladesh, a travaillé pour avoir des chaînes de valeur et une véritable traçabilité de tous nos produits qui puissent se développer. Elle a travaillé dès 2013 avec l'OIT également pour un pacte de durabilité. Mon pays, la France, s'est aussi engagé sur une législation dans son cadre national sur le devoir de vigilance. Mais on le voit bien, nous sommes dans l'Union européenne, nous sommes dans un marché intérieur où les produits circulent et où il est important que l'Union européenne travaille sur cet enjeu. C'est pourquoi la Commission européenne va faire une proposition sur le devoir de vigilance. C'est fondamental que l'Union européenne s'engage dans cette voie pour aller ensuite vers le cadre multilatéral. Et nous avons besoin aussi d'un engagement et de la détermination de l'OIT sur cet enjeu. Parce que, à l'heure actuelle, les cadres internationaux sur le devoir de la vigilance et sur la vigilance raisonnable, en fait, restent basés sur de la coopération et sur de la bonne volonté et ne sont pas toujours contraignants. Donc, n'ont pas les effets escomptés pour la protection des travailleurs et pour les objectifs qu'on peut se fixer. Une approche volontaire, en fait, à ce stade, a montré ses limites. C'est pourquoi le Parlement européen a toujours aussi été très impliqué et a demandé d'aller plus loin. Et l'OMC a un rôle fondamental à jouer. Et c'est pour quoi je suis ravie de pouvoir intervenir pour dire qu'effectivement, il faut qu'on apprenne des autres, mais il faut que véritablement, on puisse aller plus loin et on puisse avoir une réflexion complètement effective au sein de l'organisation pour avoir une protection beaucoup plus forte des droits des travailleurs qui permettent de créer aussi de la croissance et répondre au développement. Parce que, vous l'avez dit, le précédent intervenant l'a dit également, les échanges commerciaux, ils doivent créer de la croissance, ils doivent contribuer à tous les travailleurs, mais on ne doit pas avoir aussi un cadre qui soit au final pas profitable à tous. Et je voudrais dire aussi que il faut saluer peut-être la proposition américaine sur le travail forcé dans le secteur de la pêche. Ça s'inscrit aussi dans cette ambition pour inclure des normes du travail au sein de l'OMC. Et je pense qu'il est intéressant d'aller plus loin dans cette proposition, de peut-être créer un groupe de travail sur le droit forcé pour faire avancer cet agenda. Et au Parlement européen, dans la perspective de la 12e conférence ministérielle, nous adopterons une résolution où nous porterons aussi ces enjeux parce qu'il nous paraît essentiel que les droits des travailleurs dans l'ensemble du monde entier doivent être pleinement respectés et il doit y avoir des propositions concrètes. Et on le voit bien au sein de l'OMC parce que son fonctionnement fait que souvent il peut y avoir des blocages, mais c'est important que nous puissions avancer. Et l'Union européenne a fait beaucoup d'accords bilatéraux de commerce. Et ces accords bilatéraux, ils comportent des chapitres dits du développement durable, à la fois sur des enjeux du changement climatique et à la fois sur des enjeux sociétaux. Mais avec des références notamment aux conventions de l'OIT. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut constater dans ces chapitres de développement durable? C'est que nos engagements réciproques ne sont pas toujours pleinement respectés. Et que pour les faire respecter, à ce stade, nous n'avons que la bonne coopération, que le dialogue. Et on voit là encore les insuffisances d'un tel fonctionnement. C'est aussi pour ça que le Parlement européen, dans la réforme qu'il va y avoir et dans les propositions sur les chapitres des 15 points de la Commission européenne, nous souhaitons aller plus loin parce que ça nous paraît essentiel que tous les partenaires respectent pleinement leurs engagements. Le précédent orateur parlait des objectifs du développement durable, il faut pleinement les concrétiser et ça contribuera aussi à une cohérence et à une acceptation de nos politiques commerciales, de la mondialisation, par tous nos concitoyens. C'est un élément aussi fondamental dans le contexte dans lequel nous sommes, où on voit se développer un protectionnisme exacerbé sur l'ensemble du continent. Parce que promettre de faire des efforts continus, c'est plus suffisant. Il faut véritablement que ces efforts soient réalité pour aller de l'avant. Donc, je pense que, et c'est là où peut-être j'aurais une vision différente du précédent orateur, une possibilité de gradation de sanctions, c'est quelque chose sur lequel il faut réfléchir. C'est important de voir quelles pistes et quelles réalités on peut donner à cela pour avancer sur cet enjeu fondamental. Et puis, bien évidemment, comment ne pas parler de la crise pandémique, parce que la crise pandémique, elle a révélé aussi toute la vulnérabilité de nos chaînes de valeur. Donc, c'est essentiel d'avancer sur cet enjeu, là encore, d'avoir un agenda ambitieux. Et je rejoindrai en guise de conclusion mon partenaire, le précédent orateur, pour démontrer que quand même nous avons cette volonté du dialogue, cette volonté de la coopération, c'est essentiel, mais il faut être vraiment très clair sur nos objectifs et sur les ambitions de chacun.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ms. Vedran, for sharing those inspiring views, which would contribute to articulating parliamentary actions to take up that challenge. I'm now pleased to give the floor to our partner from the International Labour Organization, Ms. Marva Coulibaly. Marva, I think I may have pronounced that correctly. Marva, we wish to hear your perspectives on this important topic. So dear Ms. Coulibaly, please, we will be very grateful if you could share with us a few recommendations that could help to draft parliamentary strategy on this very specific issue. Ms. Coulibaly, the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to the co for this introduction. Thank you for the horrible echo.
We're having some problems with the audio.
Yes, I have some terrible. There's something I can do on. Is it better now?
Yes, yes, Marva.
So if I could, my presentation will probably fall somewhere in these speakers. Probably what I'll discuss is important in trade agreement.
Marva, I think we're still getting you a bit broken.
Yeah, it's really a very technical. Let me see if it's something to do with the interpretation.
Someone may have a microphone on.
I think that's what it is. Is this better now?
We're getting the feedback still.
I have the same thing.
You have the microphone.
To make sure can you hear me better now? Can you hear me better now?
Yes, Marva, much better. Proceed.
Okay, let me start to share my screen again. And my apologies for that. Yes, that's much better. Thank you. So as I was starting to say that I think this presentation will probably fall somewhere in between the two previous presentations, and it's good to have this debate. The point I'd like to make in this presentation is that the debate on trade and labor, I feel, has really shifted in the past decade or so. And it's really shifted from this question of if we should include labor provisions in trade agreements because of protectionist purposes to one of how do we include labor provisions in trade agreements. And the how is not only about the two important C's of commitments to obligations, as well as the compliance with those obligations, but it's also about a third C. And that third C has to do with cooperation and development. And the cooperation and development is extremely important in order to promote compliance with the labor standards. So for sure, labor provisions are about governance, but they're also very important tools for transnational dialogue and cooperation between the different stakeholders who are engaged in inclusive trade and decent work issues within the context of the trade agreement. And here the ILO is playing a very important role, and it's something I'd like to discuss in the rest of the presentation. So Since I only have about 8 minutes left, I'll skip a lot of the background information in terms of the debate and discussions with regard to trade and labor. And I'll start here with a multidimensional definition of labor provisions. And this multidimensional definition is based on those 3 pillars that I mentioned before. I call them the 3 C's. The first is the commitment with respect to the labor obligations. The second is the framework for compliance with the obligations that are laid out in the trade agreement. And the third is cooperation and dialogue. And this cooperation and dialogue can be done through a number of mechanisms in the trade agreement, such as established committees or other frameworks that are set up on an ad hoc or institutional basis. Based on this definition, I'd like to share with you recent figures from the ILO, where we find that out of the 344 trade agreements that are reported to the WTO, there are 103 that include labor provisions. And that's the red line you see in the figure. So 1 in 3 trade agreements include labor provisions. In addition, what we find is that the pace of the increase in labor provisions and trade agreements, the pace of it has increased over the past decade. So you see a trend of labor provisions and trade agreements since 2010 being 61%, which is much more than it was in the previous decade prior to that. So in addition to the labor obligations that are laid out in trade agreements, and their general obligations, substantive obligations, as I mentioned earlier, labor provisions can really serve as a vehicle for dealing with specific issues and labor market challenges in trade-related sectors, including in global supply chains. We find that over half of trade agreements with labor provisions refer to issues with respect to safe work, such as occupational safety and health. And this is a very important issue in the context in general, but also in the context of COVID-19. And it is an entry point for dealing with issues in trade-related sectors that have to do with safety and health. There are also quite a number of references with respect to work that should be abolished, as well as child labor and forced labor. We also find a high number of trade agreements, more than 20%, so about 1 in 5, that also deal with the treatment of workers. So there are specific provisions dealing with different groups of workers, gender provisions, provisions with respect to migrants, youth, as well as provisions on race and ethnicity, although we do see that there are lower share with respect to that. But these are all important issues, particularly with respect to the research that's showing that trade has distributional aspects on the world of work. So different workers, based on their characteristics, may be impacted differently as a result of trade. Here, I'll just go a little bit through what we're finding, just some latest developments in G7 trade agreements in particular. I won't spend all of the details, but just to give you some information in terms of implementation, a little bit on some novel developments in terms of dispute settlement. First of all, in terms of implementation, as you well know, in EU trade agreements, there are these established platforms for civil society engagement. It helps to promote dialogue, and also in terms of submitting the views directly with respect to the implementation of the agreement. And this is something that's quite particular to EU trade agreements. We've seen some novel developments as well in the context of CPTPP. On the margins of CPTPP, there is an interactive or inclusive trade action group. And this trade action group is formed by Canada, New Zealand, and Chile. And there is a commitment to work together on inclusive trade issues. And these are issues included with respect to the barriers that women face, in particular, in participating in trade. They've developed in the context of this inclusive trade group, they've developed a gender and trade arrangement, which in itself is also a standalone arrangement that's not tied to any specific group and is open to other countries. In addition, in USMCA, there was an annex 23A, and one part of getting, some of the implementation in place before the trade agreement is ratified has been this pre-ratification conditionality. And there was a pre-ratification conditionality there that required Mexico to make a series of labor law reforms prior to the trade agreement actually going into force. And just following up a little bit more on USMCA, we know there's also this novel development, the rapid response mechanism that we've recently seen tested in the case of General Motors, and we're hearing some favorable responses with respect to that. I'll go to the next slide. So what is the role that ILO has been playing with respect to trade agreements? First of all, it's primarily to support institutional frameworks for decent work. And upon request, the ILO has a number of functions. It's to advise and to give technical expertise with respect to the different phases of the trade agreement. So in the design phase, as well as implementation phase, but also with respect to enforcement, directly and indirectly through the ILO supervisory mechanism. The ILO also supports labor market reforms or legal reforms in the context of trade agreements, so aligning national laws with international labor standards, which is sometimes requested from the trade partners. There's also support on the ratification of ILO fundamental conventions, and we've seen a number of important ratifications that have gone parallel to the ratification of trade agreements. Some important ratifications have been in the case of South Korea and Vietnam with respect to forced labor, Convention 29 and 105, as well as the right to organize and collective bargaining, Convention 98, in Mexico, Vietnam, and South Korea. So they can be important tools to help support ratification of ILO conventions. In addition, and maybe the last point that I'll make with respect to the ILO's role has to do with the research and analytical tools that the ILO has been providing. The ILO provides analysis on the effectiveness of labor provisions, as well as the state of the art with respect to how labor provisions are being designed and implemented. We've had ILO research has done exhaustive mapping of labor provisions and trade agreements, as well as examining their evolution and doing cross-country comparisons. We're currently working on a research tool that I've just taken a screenshot here to show you that will be available in November 2021. It's a labor provisions and trade agreements hub, and it's going to be a user-friendly textualized database of labor provisions in all 103 trade agreements that will be categorized according to these three-pillar definition that I showed you earlier. In addition to the text of trade agreements, the hub will also include links to documents pre and post ratification, such as submissions, committee meeting documents, cooperative activities. And we hope that such a tool can help to strengthen transparency as well as engagement of social partners with respect to labor provisions in trade agreements. The final point I'd like to make is that for sure more can be done, particularly in promoting a human-centered approach. And I'd just like to remind you of the Ilo Century Declaration, where this quote comes from, that calls for a more systemic and substantive working relation between the ILO, WTO, and the Bretton Woods institutions on trade and decent work. There are a lot of promising information coming out about different ways that the WTO and the ILO may be dealing with trade and labor issues, but right now they're very much at the discussion level. But in order for the ILO to play a leading role in deepening dialogue, I think this would require a number of efforts, particularly on the part of support from parliamentarians. And I'll just lay out 4 areas very quickly before closing. One is support for continued ratification and effective implementation of ILO fundamental conventions. So not only the ratification, but also following the process and monitoring and making sure they are effectively implemented. The second has to do with support for development cooperation in the context of the trade agreements. And here I would agree with the speaker from Indonesia, because this is part of promoting compliance and enabling compliance with respect to the labor standard. And it also helps to increase the capacity of social partners to engage on trade and labor issues. And it can provide a very unique opportunity of bringing the voice of social partners to the debates on trade. The third point is to support the ILO in facilitation and engagement in dialogue on a regular basis in committees and working groups of the free trade agreements, and to act as a platform for tripartite discussions. And finally, to support the ILO to have more engagement with the international organizations and established committees and working groups that are part of the free trade agreements. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today.
And thank you very much, Ms. Corley Coulibaly, for providing us with this important and useful perspective from the International Labour Organization. May I also stress that it is important to strengthen the parliamentary cooperation with international institutions like yours, whose assistance is very important for parliamentarians in their efforts to take up the challenges the people they represent are confronted with. Thank you indeed. Now let me return to my co-chair, the floor for the question and answer period. Bernd?
Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, as I announced at the beginning, you have the possibility to raise questions here in the room. Please write it down on a piece of paper so that I can read it, so quite clear, and bring it here to me. And for the people following the discussion online, it is the platform WTO TOPF21.org, session 33. And there you can raise the question. And we have some question on the platform on 4 different areas. And I would like to ask Mr. Son and Marie-Pierre on 2 areas. First, there is a difference between your position on more cooperation, more carrot, and Marie-Pierre more sanction-based, more stick. Is this a natural difference, or is this 2 elements automatically exclude each other, or is there a possibility of merging? And second aspect, and this was also raised in the presentation of Marv from the ILO, what role of civil society in the implementation and monitoring process of labor rights do you have in mind? So perhaps, Mr. Son, you can start to answering the 2 items, please. Mr. Son from Indonesia, are you still with us?
Yes, hello, here's the technical support speaking. Mr. Zan had to leave the meeting.
Okay, so Mr. Zan is not there anymore, so Marie-Pierre, please.
Merci beaucoup, Bernd. Ça aurait été intéressant, effectivement, j'espère que notre collègue va pouvoir se reconnecter, de voir si, à votre question, on partage effectivement le fait ou non de dire que c'est inclusif, ça peut être conciliable, ces 2, je le pense. On le voit, en tout cas, l'Union européenne, elle défend déjà avant tout le dialogue et la coopération avec nos partenaires pour faire en sorte que tous les engagements de nos accords de commerce soient pleinement respectés. Mais comme je le disais, certaines fois, on voit la limite de ce process. Si je prends l'exemple, par exemple, du panel avec la Corée du Sud, justement sur la ratification de conventions de l'OIT, etc. Le panel déjà nous donne raison en disant que les engagements qui soient sur le volet commercial ou sur la question justement des droits de l'homme sont sur un pied d'égalité et doivent être pleinement respectés. Ce qui fait que justement, le dialogue, la coopération est essentielle. Mais au bout d'un moment, on voit la limite et c'est pour ça qu'une gradation de sanctions peut être un levier. Mais avoir des outils de gradation de sanctions, ça ne veut pas dire les utiliser aussi à tout va. C'est un moyen supplémentaire dans la négociation. Donc, ça peut être un axe aussi qui permette d'avancer. Donc, je ne crois pas que ça soit complètement inconciliable comme vision. Et puis, sur le rôle de la société civile, pour répondre à votre seconde question, c'est essentiel. Mais là encore, d'un pays à un autre, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par société civile? Qu'est-ce qu'on entend par implication de la société civile? On voit qu'on peut avoir différentes visions, différents types d'organisations et une liberté de la société civile qui n'est pas nécessairement toujours la même. Donc, c'est un process qu'on doit accompagner, qu'on doit développer. Mais là encore, je pense qu'il faut parfois continuer à aller plus loin.
So it seems to be clear that at the end of the story, of course, we have to reflect on enforcement procedures and the implementation regarding civil society and the monitoring, I guess, is really a crucial one so that we have a clear overview about the situation on the ground. Marva, I would like to ask you two elements. I have here a more general question, what the WTO as organization can do to improve the situation of decent work and strengthening labor rights. And secondly, or linked to this, is it a good idea, for example, to establish a working group in the WTO on labor rights? And the second issue, there was a question looking to other international organizations where different angles are triggered more in a coherent approach, in a common approach. Now here we have the ILO, we have the WTO, we have some elements also tackled in the WHO. Is a more coherent, common approach necessary? Marva, please.
Thank you for that the question. If you don't mind, I'd like to weigh in on the previous question since Mr. Sena's left, and just to say that from my perspective, most trade agreements are dialogue-based. The dispute settlement mechanism is dialogue-based. It takes years before coming to a conclusion, even in the case where there are sanctions. When we saw the one case that came forward where there were sanctions, the case was not in favor of the complaining party. So I think one of the most important parts of the trade agreement is the cooperation and dialogue mechanisms. I think it's important in trying to build capacity and strengthen labor market institutions. However, having said that, it doesn't rule out, or it doesn't mean that you don't need enforceable labor rights. Of course you need enforceable labor rights. The question is, to what extent do you have cooperation and dialogue in order to ensure that compliance is there? And one of the, where we've seen some of the effectiveness, in fact, has been in terms of, consultations, but also with respect to pre-ratification, in order to get some commitments prior to the labor agreement or trade agreement even being signed. So I'd just like to weigh in a little bit. In terms of what the WTO can do to sort of improve working relationship with the ILO, there are three things that I think would be interesting. First, to have a focused research on trade and decent work. A lot of the research that comes out of the WTO is important on trade and employment. It was a very important report a few years ago, as well as dealing with issues of wages and gender. I think more can be done in both aspects, particularly with respect to gender, but also looking at broader aspects of the labor market and taking into consideration working terms and working conditions, as well as labor rights. I think this would be a very important area of analysis so we could get a more realistic understanding of how trade is impacted on the labor market. The second thing perhaps would be with respect to maybe institutional working relationship between the WTO and ILO. We do have collaborations with respect to research studies and with respect to events, but some institutional collaborations would be quite interesting, as well as the last thing I'll say is including perhaps more labor market analysis on a systematic basis in the trade policy reviews. They are included sometimes, depending on whether or not the country chooses to include it, but on a regular and consistent basis, it's not something that's monitored by the WTO. And here, I think the WTO and ILO could have a good working relationship. In terms of the working groups, I think this is something that, the members of the ILO and the members of the WTO are very much the same governments. So I think that these decisions are made on a governmental level. I do think issues of trade and labor are becoming more and more germane. They have been, the public is insistent on discussions in this respect. So I think that in order to be able to address these issues in a very real fashion, to have meaningful change, that there needs to be more coherence between the two organizations on these issues. And your last question you asked me was, how do we bring about more coherence? I think some of these things that you mentioned previously, including, how do you come together on a regular basis within a group to discuss issues, as well as perhaps having, observer status at the different organizations to be a part of the discussions where the planning is actually taking place. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Of course, this is a long story, the relation between ILO, WTO, and other institutions. I hope in the future we can come closer together. Another block of questions, Marie-Pierre and also Marve, is dealing with the difference between developed and developing countries and the relation to decent work, specifically regarding the area of digitalization and also regarding reskilling after the pandemic and after the transformation regarding climate change. So what is your idea for the WTO and also for ILO, how we can support developing countries in the area of digitalization related to decent work and on reskilling people to have also the possibility for decent work? Perhaps Marie-Pierre.
Déjà, dans la question que vous posez, Bernd, je pense que vous avez effectivement raison de reparler spécifiquement du contexte qui est avec le changement climatique et avec le numérique, qui change complètement aussi le travail, qui va créer des emplois qu'on ne connaît pas aussi nécessairement, où donc il est nécessaire aussi d'accompagner et de former tous nos concitoyens. Donc il y a un travail, je pense, aussi à faire, déjà bien sûr, nous, au sein de l'Union européenne, mais globalement sur la scène internationale, comment on accompagne, comment on crée les conditions pour pouvoir s'adapter à ces changements. Et là, l'OMC, l'OIT et d'autres organisations ont un rôle fondamental à jouer parce que le digital transforme profondément nos usages et bien évidemment le changement climatique. Donc bien évidemment, il y a beaucoup de choses aussi sur le e-commerce, sur les subventions, la pêche, il y a beaucoup de choses avec l'agriculture dans lesquelles on attend des avancées d'un point de vue plus technique, on va dire, au sein de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce, mais comment derrière ça se décline dans la vie concrète de nos concitoyens sur l'ensemble du territoire, ça paraît peu dans nos travaux en fait. Donc effectivement, je pense qu'il va falloir davantage travailler sur cet axe-là pour pouvoir réellement être efficace et réellement accompagner. Je pense que l'OIT fait déjà énormément de choses et je pense que Maëva pourra compléter sur beaucoup de choses. Mais en tout cas, au sein de l'Union européenne, avec tout ce qu'on fait avec le plan relance et accompagner nos travailleurs, ça sera aussi un enjeu fondamental. Comment justement la dimension parlementaire et les échanges entre nous tous doivent y contribuer, parce que ça, on l'a vu depuis le début de notre échange, la coopération, c'est un élément fondamental. Nous ne pourrons pas tous tout faire. Il faut qu'on travaille véritablement sur nos chaînes de valeur. Et là, on pourra aussi peut-être répondre aux enjeux du changement climatique, parce qu'on sait bien qu'on ne pourra pas tout produire partout, que certaines matières ne se trouveront plus partout. Donc, il faut avoir conscience aussi de tout ça. Nos modes de consommation aussi, mais c'est un enjeu plus global sur la société et des réflexions que nous devons pleinement mener, associer pleinement aussi nos entreprises. Ce matin, il y avait aussi un groupe de travail justement sur comment nos entreprises étaient pleinement plus associées dans nos travaux. Et là aussi, c'est avec elles que nous pourrons justement répondre à ces objectifs réels de la place du digital et du changement climatique.
Merci beaucoup, Marve. Marve, can you come in?
Oh, my apologies. I was on mute. So if I could, I'd like to remind a bit about the ILO's Centenary Declaration, which came out already in 2019. So it's been 2 years, unbelievably, since the ILO centenary. But in that centenary declaration, there is an emphasis on a human-centered approach. And it's a human-centered approach to the future of work. And I think many of these issues that we're dealing with have to do with the future of work and how workers adapt and institutions adapt to that. There's a focus in 3 areas in particular. One, it's increasing the investment in people's capabilities. So how the whole issue of how do you reskill and improve the education as well as the skills of different people, especially when you think about not only digitalization, you think about trade as well, and how do you reskill people who lose their jobs for different jobs in terms of digitalization? How do you move people between different sectors? So this is extremely important in thinking about people's capacities. And the ILO and the WTO have worked on publications on this in the past, and this is an area of substantive work between ILO and the WTO. The second area is increasing investment in the institutions of work. So even when people are, workers are unemployed, or even when they're being reskilled, or even when they're between jobs, or even impacted as a result of trade, to ensure that there are institutions that are available, that are there to support them and provide social protection during the time when they're out of work. And these institutions as well also help with respect to retraining workers for the jobs of the future. So understanding which jobs are available for the future and being able to reskill people for those jobs. The third area is really increasing investment in decent and sustainable work. So it's not only the institutions with respect to reskilling and social protection, but also the institutions with respect to dialogue, institutions with respect to ensuring that workers have a voice. And I think this is a very important area, because through that means of dialogue, through that means of engagement, workers are able to have discussions about issues ahead of time with employers, are able to manage outcomes better. And I think this is on these 3 pillars, actually, I think this is a way that moving forward, you can leave no one behind and try to address these issues in a more coherent fashion.
Thanks a lot. Of course, this needs also some money, and we have to reflect how to really provide with aid for this kind of development, developing countries. No doubt about this is a responsibility for developed countries. Once again, I would like to remind you that for technical reason, we can't have here a discussion in the room, and nobody can take the floor. If there's a question or remark, write it down and bring it here to the table. And the guests online following the discussion have to use the platform www.topf21.org. To both of you, Marve and Marie-Pierre, in the beginning, and I have also a question here, Mr. Sun mentioned that the obligations of workers' rights and decent work might be understood by developing countries as a new form of social imperialism from developed countries, and really hinder their possibilities to have a developing and a growth and a well-being. What would be your answer to this discussion, Marie-Pierre?
Je pense au débat que nous avons souvent au Parlement européen et en tant que Française, souvent dès qu'on pousse certains sujets, notamment par exemple le mécanisme carbone sur le volet environnemental, les droits des travailleurs, on est toujours perçus comme des protectionnistes. Et je ne crois pas que ce soit ça. En tout cas, moi, c'est pas ma vision des choses. Au contraire, le commerce international, il est un levier justement pour avoir une mondialisation qui soit juste et pour faire en sorte que des pays qui sont plutôt pays en voie de développement puissent avoir des standards qui soient plus hauts et qu'on puisse les accompagner. Ce n'est pas une nouvelle forme de protectionnisme que de garantir le respect de ces droits à tous, pas du tout. C'est justement faire en sorte que nos accords commerciaux soient un levier pour créer de la croissance et soient un levier pour créer de l'emploi, pour garantir des droits, pour avoir une dignité, pour gagner de l'argent, etc. Donc, c'est en ça où je m'inscris en faux dans cette approche-là. En tout cas, ce n'est pas la vision que souhaite défendre l'Union européenne. Ce n'est pas comme ça qu'on conçoit le fait de nos chapitres développement durable et de demander à ce que nos partenaires respectent, déjà ratifient des conventions de l'OIT, puis les respectent. Ce sont des conventions internationales. C'est essentiel qu'on puisse aller de l'avant tous ensemble. Vous avez évoqué dans la question précédente le changement climatique, le numérique. C'est des enjeux qu'on doit relever collectivement. Bien évidemment, chacun avec sa part de responsabilité, mais c'est cette part de responsabilité qui ne se cache pas derrière du protectionnisme qu'on doit accompagner, et les droits des travailleurs, ils sont essentiels et ils doivent être pleinement garantis.
In addition, I've just here a statement that social clause and trade agreements create new trade barriers, and shouldn't be the discussion to handle the social items the duty of the ILO than the WTO? Should the WTO stick to the question of trade barriers and to remove trade barriers than creating new ones? Marie-Pierre.
Je redis ce que j'ai dit un petit peu avant. Pour moi, ce n'est pas des obstacles au commerce, ce n'est pas des nouvelles formes de barrières au commerce. Effectivement, avant, les accords de commerce, ils sont là pour supprimer des barrières tarifaires et effectivement aussi, il ne faut pas qu'il y ait des barrières non tarifaires. Au contraire, c'est vraiment pour aller ensemble vers le plus haut et tirer la mondialisation vers le haut. Et par ailleurs, on le voit bien, et c'est des débats qu'on a au Parlement européen, il y a une demande de cohérence entre toutes nos politiques. On ne peut pas avoir d'un côté des politiques commerciales qui sont seulement dans la libéralisation et de l'autre côté des politiques qui ne respectent pas les droits humains fondamentaux. C'est des demandes très très fortes de la société civile. On parlait dans les questions précédentes sur l'implication des sociétés civiles justement dans notre politique commerciale. Ce n'est pas qu'en Europe qu'il y a des questionnements sur justement des accords de commerce, même voire des accords de commerce type les APE avec l'Afrique, qui sont normalement censés être favorables au continent africain. Donc, c'est de manière globale qu'il y a une attente très forte de nos concitoyens. Donc, c'est essentiel et c'est de notre responsabilité aussi en tant que politique d'assurer une cohérence à la fois entre le commerce et à la fois entre d'autres politiques. Et je dirais par ailleurs, pour finir, que le commerce, ce n'est pas une fin en soi. C'est un outil. c'est un levier, c'est pas une fin en soi.
So trade as a tool and then not as an end in itself. So, yeah. Marvin. Marvin, you can come in, please.
Yes, I can come in. I would agree with the Marie-Pierre in the sense that it's a flawed perspective to think of labor standards as a cost. This is not borne out in the research, nor is this borne out on a practical level. And I'll give two reasons for that. First, there is no evidence that shows that labor provisions or respect for labor standards and trade frameworks leads to any type of protectionist backlash. Neither is with respect to a slowdown in trade, nor with respect to violations being claimed from a position of protectionism. There's simply no evidence of that. The second point is that, in fact, there is more evidence that shows that the promotion of workers' rights are an enabling factor that help to impact on other labor rights, on working conditions. And this actually has a beneficial impact for the enterprise by improving productivity, while at the same time leading to long-run sustainable growth. So I would push back very strongly on those 2 points. And there's evidence of that in not only research from the ILO and the Better Work Program and the textile sector, which shows the benefits of respecting labor rights in tradable sectors, but also in academic literature as well. One other point that I'd like to make is, I think it was a previous point that you had in the other question in terms of financing for this. And I think that, there was a question about, this is a trade barrier and the WTO dealing with one aspect and the ILO dealing with another aspect. I think in order to improve the labor market situation in general and to recognize the recognition of how trade may be impacting on the labor market in some very positive ways, but in some distributional aspects as well. It would be important to think about how in these aid for trade frameworks to consider labor market institutions as well. It's one of the building blocks to have trade have a stronger impact with respect to employment, wages, and other decent work aspects. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So studies are showing that respect of labor rights, decent works is really getting benefit for the economic system. One question raised here is the format of labor provision in trade agreements. Marve showed us this overview about different labor provisions in different trade agreements. And of course, there is a difference between some of them and the USMCA, where a more company-orientated provisions are foreseen, and this rapid alert system is directed on some companies, not on the country. So perhaps we can also discuss a little bit this different approach. Should labor provision be more orientated on the whole country, or should it more orientated on a company? Marie-Pierre.
À mon avis, aux deux. Aux deux. Les dispositions, le droit du travail, il n'est pas déconnecté des entreprises. Bien au contraire, c'est dans les entreprises que la vie des travailleurs se fait. Mais les États ont une responsabilité aussi vis-à-vis de leur entreprise et vis-à-vis de leurs concitoyens. Donc, c'est aux deux. Après, on le sait bien, et c'est des débats qu'on a, par exemple, quand on traite de certains accords bilatéraux au sein du Parlement européen. Quand on négocie un accord de commerce, certes, vous avez les négociateurs ensemble et c'est un gouvernement à un moment donné, mais vous négociez avec un État, non pas un gouvernement spécifiquement. Donc, il y a des moments où c'est plus évident que d'autres et on va dire, dans les phases de négociation, c'est peut-être plus simple parce que vous pouvez aller dans le même sens. Mais en tout cas, je pense que c'est aux deux. En tout cas, chacun a sa responsabilité pour avoir un droit des travailleurs et pour avoir une gouvernance mondiale qui soit plus efficace.
Merci beaucoup. Marve, quick response because we are running out of time.
Sorry, just quickly, we've known that in order to deal with issues with respect to global supply chains, it's important to deal with some of the labor rights issues at the enterprise level. And there have been different models of doing that. And I believe that Marie-Pierre spoke to that earlier in terms of, voluntary initiatives, CSR, then, discussions of due diligence. So I think we've been coming to this approach, but it's quite novel in terms of, including this in the labor chapter of trade agreements. It's a first. So far, it's been getting a lot of interest and attention and some initial benefits. So it would be interesting, I think, to see where this leads and if this is a future of provisions. I'll leave it there.
Indeed. So the experience might be really interesting. So thanks a lot to the experts here, Marve and Marie-Pierre. Thanks a lot to my co-chair. Thanks a lot to the audience. And I guess we will stick to this topic for a longer time so that at the end of the day, we have really decent work for all workers on our globe. Thanks a lot. Have a good time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bernd.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.